Welcome, everyone. I hope that you're doing really well. Thank you so much for dropping by as we are talking about a topic that I've received a lot of requests for a long time to delve into. And I'm kind of doing it just on the spot here. I've not really prepared too many outlines or anything because I think that this is a topic that I just have to look at in a fresh way. It's kind of one of those things that if you maybe prepare too much, it just kind of seems too like pushed or too pressurized. So the shadow self is one of the main topics that I work on, especially like one-on-one with clients in my practice. So the shadow self is so interesting right now. I think that this topic became really popular around 2014, especially when we had Saturn go through Scorpio. I think it became more of a collective societal rage. Like, oh my gosh, I want to figure out my shadow self. I want to learn about, the unseen part of myself, the parts of myself that I haven't really, confronted before. And that's beautiful and that's incredible. But I do believe that the shadow self, like a lot of spiritual topics, has sort of garnered a reputation or an idea that is not really what it is. So it becomes that, when people start to think that something is something, that's what it becomes, because that's sort of the way that human thought and confrontation works. But yeah, before I dive too far into this video, I just wanted to say, like, hashtag thank you patrons. This video is becoming because of my patrons. In fact, one of my patrons requested this specifically, and it came to me, and I thought, this is perfect timing. It's Scorpio season. We just had the mercurial solar eclipse as I'm recording this. That was just a few hours ago. So I think that the Sun Mercury conjunction in Scorpio is the perfect opportunity for me as a channeler and an intuitive, and as someone who's practiced with these themes, to really articulate, hopefully, about what this topic means and how you can work with it in your own self-practice. So yes, if you haven't checked out my Patreon page, please go over there and check it out. I have a lot of great content. You get the readings early and ad free, and I do random posts over there, and it's a wonderful community. And I would so appreciate to have you if you would like to go and check that out. But anyway, moving into the topic of the shadow self. Before we go into the shadow self, we have to sort of understand the concept of self, okay? Which, I mean, it seems pretty self-explanatory. Ah ha ha ha. Yes, it is a self-explanatory topic, the topic of the self. The self is beneath the conscious mind, okay? This is an important distinction before we dive into shadow self. The conscious mind is not necessarily representative of the self because it is an amalgamation of conscious thought. So this is very influenced by society, very influenced by people around us. The self lies beneath the conscious mind. So the self is where we find motivation. The self is where we find, our soul's path, all of those things, that are aside from the influence of others, okay? So when you start to work on the self or the shadow self, or, all of the different versions of the self, there requires a detachment from society, social dynamics, interpersonal relationships, and again, the influence of others. This is why working with the shadow self can be dangerous out of the right circumstances. Okay, it's become a very fringy type of stylish idea to work with the shadow, to work with the darkness, which is another problem and incorrect thing. People associate the shadow self with that which is dark, okay, with the darkness, which is not correct, because the shadow self, it's almost more like if you were thinking of like Mercury shadow, like in its retrograde. It's like the this is where it gets difficult to articulate. The shadow self is not the dark self by definition. It's the self that is has gone unacknowledged and been buried by conscious rubble, basically. And if we want to associate that with something that is dark, that's where we start to get into problems, because it can be for some people. The shadow self can maybe be an experience with the darkness, but this popular craze of the shadow self being something that is inherently dark has led people to embrace lower vibrations, negative entities. Not that darkness is inherently bad, but light is important in this dimension, in this realm. Again, as humans, okay, again, we're the whole shadow self craze has led us to want to act inhumanely. Okay, we are humans. Without light, we have no sensory direction. We have no, not again. Darkness is not a bad thing. Okay, and we have to really define what darkness means. So we're going to kind of go linearly here for a minute. So first of all, the idea of the shadow self is the idea of the self that has been buried by conscious rubble and by influence of other people, by social dynamics, and by our own fears. Okay, it has been buried, so a part of ourself is going unseen. Okay, that association has been garnered with the attraction to something that is dark. Okay, which is a problem that has led spirituality to be an addictive, cyclic thing for some people. Okay, so the shadow self, the unseen self, could be dark, but it could also be very light. So for a lot of people, and actually the vast majority of people, a shadow journey is actually a re-encountering of light and a re-encountering of the positive aspects of your personality, or the re-encountering of your true wants, aside from that which you've been encouraged by others to pursue. That is a lot of what a shadow journey for many people looks like. Another association that the shadow self has sort of taken on within the popular craze of spirituality is that it's the aspect of ourselves that we don't have control over, or the aspects of ourselves that are convincing us, or so we have a grammar linguistic thing here, the aspect of oneself that convinces one to do things that are bad for it, but tricks it into thinking that they're good. Okay, this is not the shadow self. Okay, this is a problem where things and ideas and spiritual practices have amalgamated into one, and started to trick people off. So one person's shadow journey could be a matter of working with self-delusionment, and another person's shadow journey could be a matter of getting back in touch with the inner child. And it's all become a shadow journey because it's esoteric, or it's not been seen by them before. And that's the popular idea of shadow journey. But I think that we as spiritual people really need to gain a bit more of linguistic diversity of what these things are, because when we try to connect with them, or we try to relate to each other, it can fall flat within that, or we might be talking about one thing when it's actually the other. So yes, the shadow self, when it is in this ideal of being the trickster, or the delusionment, whatever we want to call that. This is another form of quote unquote shadow self work, where we are seeing how we are deprecating or sabotaging ourselves. Okay, again, this isn't really shadow work per se. But this is seeing, again, a part of ourself that we associate with the darkness, which is an addictive process that can not be great for everybody, but it works for some people. Here is what the shadow self truly is. The shadow self is naked. Okay. The shadow self is you. It's the part of yourself that is not dressed up or made up or edited or energizing through the influence or ideals of other people. Shadow self is basically ultimate vulnerability and ultimate selfhood. And this has become so shadowy because we've been so disconnected from it as a species and as a people. We've become very, not so tuned into that. It's about, building wealth. It's about, having the house, having the security, which for some people is really the right thing. Like, that can be truly vulnerable and truly authentic for them. But not for everybody. So some people are not so accustomed to operating in such a heavy, dense realm. And what you have is people getting very out of touch with their own talents and their own gifts, and trying to persuade themselves or being persuaded by others that, they just need to conform. And then that's where the shadow self starts to operate subconsciously, and you do start to see like addictions and self-sabotage complexes, self-deprecation, where you have somebody operating in the conscious mind, being driven from the conscious mind activates and is driven by the subconscious shadow self. So this is where the crisis has come from. And as humanity, we shifted into a paradigm actually around the time of like 2009, but it really finished up around 2014 and got locked in, where we see this and where we feel this and where we know this. And thus is born the movement of the contact with the shadow self. And again, we have a lot of language that Again, amalgamates is my word of the day. All of these sort of spiritual themes into one, and it's been branded shadow self, which is again just a tricky thing. But I mean, it's not wrong, it's not incorrect, but it is problematic for some people because shadow work, it's right for some people, but it is not right for everybody. Okay, shadow work is not right for everybody. It's not meant to be utilized by certain people who are not. Basically, it can have you creating wounds for yourself or creating patterns or paths that bypass an easiness. It can make things too complicated for one. And some people, it's so important. You know, some people who have had many past wounds of, being told that, 2 + 2 = 5, and it's very simple. They need to complicate things for themselves. They need to see, the formula in a non-simplified version. This is really good for some people. But for others, again, there can maybe simplicity is better, and maybe having the formula in a simplified version is the answer, and there aren't necessarily needs to go on a million different detours just to get a few feet ahead. You know what I mean? A shadow journey can oftentimes come as a detour in your life path. If you go on a shadow journey, it will inhibit your progress, okay? When it comes to real world material things, it will take down your productivity. It will take down your profitability. It will move you slower in the real world because your journey will start to happen in other dimensions. It will start to happen in your own mind, and that will hit the pause button. But then, of course, it can introduce you to a paradigm where things can get much more abundant or things can get much more good. But I just want to say the main moral for this video is that this shadow self, shadow work, shadow journey, these are fringy terms that have encompassed too much and become something that is a little bit too popular. And it should be sort of looked at something similar to like the Holy Grail, really, where it's something that everybody could access if they wanted to, but it is not necessarily something. It's almost like Pandora's box as well for some people. It really is unleashing a can of worms that doesn't need to be at times, but some people need it. Okay, some people do. Some people really do need that journey, and most people have incarnated into this timeline to have that journey to some degree, okay? Even if it's not consciously ordered or it's not like with intention. I mean, a lot of people are having a journey with shadow self and they don't even know it, It's not like being spiritually triggered, like you're not going to someone saying, okay, how do I journey with the shadow self? A lot of people are just having it naturally, and it's being interpreted through their subconscious minds, okay? So that's another important thing to realize about this time and working with shadow self is that everybody is naturally in a way, and until about 2025, people will be, okay? People will be subconsciously working with shadow. But here we are, and I would assume that anybody who's watching this video and has gotten this far into the video is very spiritually calibrated and wanting to really take conscious control of these spiritual means, which is not bad. But again, I would definitely caution setting an intention of lightening the shadow world, because something is no longer shadow when it reaches the conscious mind. And this is a harsh truth for some people. Once we see something, okay, so we see that we have an addictive tendency, we see that we've self-sabotaged, we see that we've done these things that seem dark, they're no longer dark anymore, okay? Things are only shadow really when they've been unseen or when they've been, when you can't perceive them, okay? Perception, you're working with perception when you're in a shadow journey. And once it's been perceived, it defies shadow, the concept of shadow. So this is sort of actually what I've been trying to get to through this whole video, is that we like to think that things are shadow when they're not. We like to think that, okay, this was a negative thing that happened to me, therefore it's in shadow. No, negativity is not by definition shadow, or what we have associated with what shadow is, okay? Negativity is still perceived. Negativity is still seen. It's still acknowledged. And if you have perceived that you are working in self-sabotage or that you are being bad to yourself, that has now pervaded the shadow and entered into the conscious mind and is now something that you can begin to alter in the physical world and begin to change. So the obsession with the shadow is the obsession with figuring out that which we don't already know. Okay, so seeing, which is important. Okay, and that can be a great thing. If you're maybe being very abusive and don't know it, or if you're really hurting yourself or starving your body and don't know it, this is where shadow work is a good thing, because it's important to figure these things out. However, we can also get very attached to it and like, oh, I realized I've had an eating disorder for all of these years, or oh, I realized that I was verbally abusing my children and didn't realize it, or anything that might be a shadow. It's out of shadow now, and now you can change it. And we like to get caught in a sort of purgatory with shadow work as well, where we see, okay, I've had an eating disorder for all these years, or okay, I've verbally abused my children. I'm still sort of doing these things, but I'm in a shadow journey. So, but I'm still doing them, but I realize it, but they're shadow. But it's not changed. And you see how that sort of becomes like a very bad existential crisis. So the shadow journeys, when we choose to look at them as like this positive like process, can really encourage a purgatorial type of existential crisis if we can't get into the driver's seat and make the changes that we need to make. So yes, oftentimes an existential crisis will also fuel a shadow journey. So I'm going to sort of start a part 2 of this video. So part 1, we've kind of talked about the whole theme of shadow, what it means, and what we have, kind of associated linguistically with that term, and how that's, debatable. Now I'm going to talk about more true shadow journeys, how they are good and how they are bad, and how they tend to come into your life and what that means. So oftentimes a shadow journey, or the shadow self, will introduce itself after a long and drawn out trauma, especially an existential trauma. So it's less common for this to come out in a very acute type of trauma. So for example, if you were attacked or mugged or robbed, and this happens in a short amount of time, it is less likely to trigger this type of thing. But a long existential crisis type of trauma, where you're maybe in an abusive relationship for years, or you're broken up with someone who's like abused you, yet you want them back, and it's really long and drawn out and complex. These are mainly the types of traumas that will really trigger the shadow self to start operating in the conscious mind. So what does this mean? This means that if you've gone through a long and drawn out existential type of trauma cycle, it does probably mean that you needed to see it. Okay, you needed to see how you acted and reacted to this person. It doesn't mean that you deserved it. That's not what I'm saying. It doesn't mean that you deserved a trauma. But there may have been a way over many lifetimes of a soul acting that was leading it to defy what it's sort of meant to do. Or it's not about destiny, but it is about realizing what you love in life, because we're kind of here on earth also to enjoy and to love. It is important to realize how we've prevented that or not allowed that of ourselves. So oftentimes an existential trauma that is long lasting will come in as a result of defying ourselves or depriving ourselves of enjoyment and love. And it will oftentimes last until there's something that clicks within, okay, that says, okay, whoa, I'm depriving myself of love. I'm depriving myself of happiness. And then all of a sudden that trauma will climax, and there will be like a cutoff, and there will be a split of the time and a split of the experience, where then people have to exist in a type of solitude, and people have to look at the past, and people have to maybe even miss the trauma, or wish to reintroduce it, or try to reintroduce it, because this is what happens chemically in the brain. Humans can become addicted to pain, trauma, suffering, and when that changes, when they're introduced into solitude or a new situation, withdrawals can happen. So oftentimes people will try to reintroduce pain or reintroduce trauma as a form of Stockholm syndrome. And what happens through this time is that it's often deprived, okay? When this trauma or when this existential crisis or cycle has been ongoing or lasted for a long time, and we have this split realization that I'm talking about of needing things to get better and things cut off, we may try to re-enter the trauma and it will reject us. This is where the true shadow self version of the journey comes in. This is where you're really working with shadow self, is when you have tried to re-enter into a trauma cycle and it rejects you. This is what I've seen in people. As someone who has worked with many people through shadow journey, hundreds of clients, this is the main shadow formula. It's that want to be back in pain and trauma, but being rejected by pain and trauma that catalyzes most people's shadow journey. And this is the most authentic, I think, form of coming into contact with what we have termed the shadow. And it can really take years, okay? Oftentimes the closure process is slow. There can be delusions, self-aggrandizement. There can be a perilous sort of maze of orienting yourself with reality, because the realities are quite skewed and maze-like right now in our current paradigms, and especially to introduce the shadow right now and over the last few years, it's been inevitable for some, but also very difficult because it's not, and this is maybe sort of the nature of life right now, this is not the greatest paradigm for shadow work, yet it is very, very common and very, maybe hard to avoid, which is, hello, humanity. um, Again, not to discourage people from shadow work, but I do think that the whole idea of the glamorization of the shadow self and the that's not so good. Okay, shadow journeys come naturally. They're not something to be what's the word? They're not something to be sought after with intention. Okay, they come naturally, and once you're in them, you can then work with intention to hopefully get through it as quickly as possible and to learn as much as you can and to grow stronger. Okay. But yes, to get back on track with this sort of second part of the video, when the shadow journey comes after the result of an existential type of trauma, oftentimes you will see health crisis because it is shocking for the conscious mind to be integrated with something that was never meant to be conscious. It is shocking for the physical body to begin to change at a cellular level as a result of the conscious and subconscious mind forcing themselves on each other. It is like the birth of a galaxy, really, where there is a big reaction, okay? Because again, what makes the shadow self, quote unquote shadow, is the fact that it's not conscious, okay? So we have a path and a almost an osmosis of the subconscious and conscious mind at this time in this paradigm. And that's not easy for the human body to deal with. I mean, you can see madness, you can see overt physical illness, you can see a lot of difficult things. And this is especially for people who get initiated into shadow journey, but then live in delusionment. So delusionment can come as the result of a shadow journey. And oftentimes when we go through the solitude phase of a shadow journey, there can be delusionment there, or self-aggrandizement, or vampiric things that come up as well. This is just what I've seen in my practice. And here's the thing, guys, just from my own practice, the shadow self is embraced sometimes when it shouldn't be. That's just what I'm going to say. Again, it's not about sweeping things under the rug. It's not about lying to yourself or forcing yourself, to believe I'm perfect, because that fuels the shadow in a negative way. We can accept the truths of our being. We can see where we've gone wrong. We can see all of these aspects and right them through our own ability to perceive. We don't want to glorify these things and exalt them in a way where they aren't changeable. Sometimes we exalt these things that we associate with shadow in a way that makes them more difficult to change and more difficult to overcome, right? And there's plenty of really great spirituality that you can have that might have been conflated with shadow journeys. So, seeing the truth about something is not necessarily a shadow journey, unless that's what you want to make it out to be. Maybe it's just a realization or an epiphany. Maybe it's like a light journey, actually, because you've really shed light on something. Again, light is important in this dimension. We need to see without, if you think of abject darkness and you think of blackness, that is not something that humans are meant for, okay? Not at all. All of our perceptions and health rely on light and high vibration. And the shadow wave, if again we're talking about the societal wave, has glorified the lower vibrational darkness. And there are times where we have to see it. Without perceiving it, we could be more subject to its pain. So it's not all bad, but it is also glorified right now. And it is also contributing to masses and masses of people falling into ancient, feudal, vampiristic, problematic lower vibrational cycles. So if you could have a light journey, light journeys are also really good. And that's really what a lot of us are catching on to, when we're journaling, when we're seeing the past, when we're, having like the great cup of coffee and saying like, wow, I didn't have to abuse myself in that way. I didn't have to put myself through that. That is a light. That is a perception of what used to be shadow but no longer is, and we are now in the driver's seat and we can change it. Go on that journey, right? But again, shadow journey happening at Solitude after the existential trauma. That is a time where you have to be so there for yourself, okay? You have to, limitations come up during that time. Oftentimes you have to quit something. You have to maybe drop out of something. You have to make more time to be with yourself. You have to probably spend more money on healthier lifestyle. It's very likely that a lot of debts have racked up over the time of the existential trauma. It's very likely, again, the health might not be so good. Again, do you see how these are all symptoms of a very low vibration? All things that we see when a vibration is very low, when a shadow journey is initiated. Okay, so the true answer to a shadow journey is to raise your vibration, which does mean not glorifying the shadow, not obsessing with what has gone wrong, not obsessing with how you've lashed out at yourself, but rather perceiving where you've gone wrong, perceiving how you've messed up, and choosing to change those actions, and not dwelling and marinating in low vibration. Because watch debts, bad health, abusive people, old past worn out situations, watch them swirl around your life like a prison when you choose to glorify the shadow or glorify, because that's, yeah. Okay, so this actually isn't really the direction that I expected to go, and this video is turning out to be so long. This isn't really the direction that I expected with this video. I expected it to be a little bit more soft and a little bit more shadow self, really think, wow, you've entered this journey type of thing. But that's not what's come out, and I can never really predict with the channelings what will come out. Again, we are having a very, very clear shadow time, Mercury conjunct Sun in retrograde Scorpio energy eclipse. So I think that this is maybe illuminating, okay, about the shadow. And that, 2020, 2021, 2022, these are going to be times of potent shadow journeys for people, because it is associated with the water and earth elements in astrology, which are considered the dark elements. But they are not always. Again, there can actually be dark fire and dark air, as well as light water and light earth. It's not just streamlined, but again, the nighttime. And again, I think people associate the nighttime with shadow. And I mean, yes, there are shadows about, but again, this is a lingual type of association because the night still has a lot of light in it, right? Again, humans are not really knowing sometimes what they're tapping into. We don't have a perception of absolute darkness as humanity. As we are quite close to a sun star, absolute darkness is not something humans are meant for. And we have never perceived it, and you've never perceived it. So try to not tap into that unless you are really, some people are suited to journey through these darknesses. That is a journey for some people. But I just maybe wanted to, what am I wanting to say? I wanted to validate for you that if you might be thinking of a shadow journey, or you might be feeling like the shadow is coming in, or feeling that really validated for you at this time in your life, it might also be a realization or an epiphany or a perception of how things could be better. And it might be interesting to think about how great things could be if we didn't disguise that as the darkness or as the difficulty. If you have maybe a very investigative, like probing mind, or a lot of Scorpio, you might be sort of be like, oh no, the shadow is not what I thought it was. Oh no. There are plenty of things to investigate and probe in this life. There are plenty of things to like look into. It might be good to channel that into other things, or to like really channel into your past, or to channel into and investigate where things went wrong. This is not necessarily shadow, but it is rewarding for some people, and it is the right thing to do. And so shadow work, maybe I'll make a video specifically about shadow work and what that is about next. But I do think that I will conclude this video here, or here in a second at least. I'm just trying to think if anything else needs to come through about the shadow self, because this is more about the shadow self than about shadow work per se. So yes, the shadow self does get so much, talking time from so many people right now. It's a popular schematic that we are operating through. Just watch yourself. Watch your actions, watch your choices, watch your wants and desires, and record them and remember them. Oftentimes, working with the shadow or a quote unquote shadow self is just about acknowledging and validating your memories. Okay, memories are a very beautiful, bright, shining, dazzling, deep and somber thing in this paradigm. So oftentimes people mistake a journey with memories and creating a present for themselves that is nice for a shadow journey. Maybe you can do that via a shadow journey. I suppose one could, but it's also not completely necessary either, and it could maybe be a lot more complicated than it has to be. So something to ask yourself if you are feeling like a shadow really acknowledges, and am I maybe having a tendency, and this could be like real shadow work, am I having a tendency to like overcomplicate something, or am I having the tendency to maybe hold on to an addiction by making the process of overcoming it a lot more drawn out, lengthy, and psychological than it has to be. There are things such as that. And as I was saying, also acknowledge your memories, acknowledge the past, and work on developing a present through like healthy progress that overcomes those narratives. And you've basically done, I think, what popular shadow work is setting out to do. And if that can maybe become a process that doesn't necessarily rely on darkness to overcome, it could maybe be so much more rewarding for some people. It's not right for everybody. Some people, again, are very incarnated for a shadow journey. That is true. But some people also are not, and it can maybe be sad to watch people submerge themselves in shadow unnecessarily. So shadows are beautiful, but you also have to remember that like the shadows that when we see like a shadow, it's like beautiful in like the evening twilight or something. This is as a result of light. In darkness, there are no shadows, okay? Of what we perceive in the English language as like a shadow, because that is through light being cast on something. In the darkness, there is only void, null, gray, nothingness, okay? Incomplete darkness. And that is sometimes what we tap into unknowingly when we're on a shadow journey. And that is sort of one of the reasons that I made this video as well, was because I wanted to remind you that tapping into the light can also be super rewarding. And there are a very few amount of people who are meant to work with the darkness in a healthy way. But it's good to be reminded of the simplicity of that darkness is not what we think it is. It is a very null, void type of dead energy. Okay, so do we want to tap into death and deadness when we're trying to heal ourselves? I think not. So anyway, everyone, thank you so much for checking out this video. I may make a follow-up to it if I get more insights. Enjoy the light, enjoy the healthy shadow. Okay, so maybe there is like a healthy type of shadow journey where you're kind of working with light, and it's like playing with light illusions and things like that. I am sensing that as well. I think there's just maybe a complexity that we've developed through the defining of shadow and assigning it the word shadow, and like what people consider that to be. Language, if y'all really wanted to heal, healing through language is maybe not a fun sounding way to heal, but let me tell you, language is a very responsible party for a lot of trauma, okay? And how we heal. People who speak different languages heal in very different ways. So that's another interesting thing. Maybe it's another video for another time. Comment below, let me know how this came off. I'm hoping that this video didn't send the wrong message, because I'm not here to cheapen anybody's journey. If you've had a great shadow journey, or like worked with the darkness in a way that healed you, great. Like, do not let me cheapen that in any way. But I did want to come to certain people who might be considering this and really elucidate what it could actually be for them, and maybe there are easier ways to heal, and maybe booking a session with me. If you guys wanted to book a private reading, I'll put that link below as well, because I do journey through the shadow. I look at the darkness for people so that they don't really have to like go crazy into that themselves, and I can help guide through that, because we kind of tap into that hermit energy when we're being guided through the darkness, so on and so forth. But anyway, thanks so much everyone for being here, and we will be talking soon. Again, I might do a follow-up depending on how this video goes and what the response is. It's one of these topics that is so deep, and so again, it's the shadow, right? You can go on and on and on. Anyway, thanks so much everyone for being here. We will be talking soon. If you wanted to sign up to my Patreon page, I'm going to link that in the center of the screen. If you've been thinking about doing it for a while, I would so appreciate it. It's a great time to do it, because we'll be having December readings and extended readings going up over there, which are ad-free and extended just by having the Patreon membership. So this video is as a part of the Thank You Patrons Patreon promotion. So it's just sort of like thanking all of my patrons. As of today, I have 297 of them. So thank all 297 of you for being here on Patreon. And I hope that I've helped you to understand some of what the Shadow Journey is about. And jump over to Patreon if you haven't already, and definitely do a subscription today. Thanks so much, everyone. We'll be talking soon. Bye.